Hey guys, welcome to Capturing Christianity. I'm here today with J. Warner Wallace, and he's recently released a book, Person of Interest. Go ahead and put it on the screen for you guys. This is what it looks like in all of its glory. Pretty cool. It's got what is this? Blood splatter right here. Did you work with any blood splatter experts?
Yeah, actually, I had to do a week, and we had to become just enough of an expert in blood spatter that we would know what we're looking for and who to call and how to interpret it. So we would all go to FBI training. It was in Sacramento, and there was a nurse who was also a forensic criminalist at FBI, and she would bring in pints of blood, and she would soak various objects, and then we would smack them in closed environments to see what the cast-off looks like, to see what spatter looks like, because the chemistry of blood is hard to reproduce in terms of what it'll actually do when it hits the wall. So we were smacking things, right? And it's a big mess. And this is back probably before, but I don't know if we would do that in COVID situations. Maybe they're not doing that anymore. I don't know. But so then at the very end, what she would do is she would set up a scenario in a room where the body looks like a crime scene's occurred. There's blood spatter everywhere, but the body's been removed. And then we have to reconstruct what we think happened in the room based on the blood spatter. That's the final assignment of the course.
Who was the standout student? Was that you?
No, it was not me. It should have been, right? I mean, I feel like I have an artistic ability to see the perspectives and see all that. But
and also it says right here, it says America's foremost cold case detective. Right? So
yes, but where did they get that quote from? Me. No, they didn't get it from me. But the point is, but yeah.
No, seriously, who said that? Who put that?
It's been said by. Well, so what happened for me was I ended up on Dateline.
Your mom?
Yeah, my mom, more than anybody else. But that was only because NBC Universal is up the street. As a matter of fact, I was just on the phone last night with the producer from Dateline talking about 2 more potential shows. Well, a lot of that is just because you form a relationship, like with Keith Morrison. So when these folks will start calling you things, it starts to stick or starts to show up in other publicity, things that they're doing for NBC Universal. And then you get the label. And so at first when I was doing it, it was helpful because my agency did not want to pay for a cold case team. That's an expensive team, especially when these are old cases that no one's calling the station about anymore. But if you're on Dateline, then you bring positive publicity to your agency. Well, then they're far more likely to fund your team. So we knew early on this wasn't going to hurt us because we would actually keep our team as long as the agency felt like it was worth doing. So this Dateline stuff actually ended up being a blessing for us.
Hey, before we get into the actual content, I wanted to ask you a question about the show Dexter. Have you seen that show?
Oh, yeah. I haven't seen the reboot. I have not seen any of the reboot.
Okay, I only saw the first episode, but I watched all of the previous seasons, and I was a pretty hardcore. We even named our dog after Dexter. Like his name is Dexter. Because he was black,
so basically now when you get into a civil suit with somebody because your dog bit them, they're going to argue that, see, he's been trained to do this because his name is even Dexter. So good luck with that civil suit, okay?
Well, the reason I brought that up is because I wanted to ask you, and this actually, the paint splatter on the front of the book made me think about Dexter because he was a blood splatter expert in the show. Yeah. And so I wanted to ask you, was that show accurate? Was it inaccurate?
So there's a part of it, there's definitely a science to how physics and chemistry with blood move, and all that's true. But there is also an element of interpretation, right? More than one action could produce the same kind of effect on the wall. So some of this is interpretive. Now, I'd say it's probably more science than it is art, but there is some art in that science. So that's why I say, if you got spatter, well, then of course, all you can really say is that, the better you get at it, the more you can say, I'm sure. But I still think there's as much art, not as much, but some art in this science. Not as much art, perhaps, as there is in forensic statement analysis. There's a lot more art in that than there is in blood spatter evidence. But I do think you have to interpret, okay, so what are the, be honest, there's 2 or 3 different mechanisms that could cause that. Let's talk about all 3, rather than just land one of them as if, and this is what happens typically in these kinds of shows, right? You want a certain level of certainty. And it doesn't, we have this thing called the CSI effect. Like I suppose we're going to have a Dexter effect, where jurors are going to think that we can have a certain level of certainty based on forensic analysis that really isn't available to us because they've seen it on TV. And we have to kind of help them to understand that, no, we can't, you don't have that level of certainty. Yeah, it's TV.
Okay, so maybe it's a good time to get into the actual content of the book.
Okay.
Well, I guess I have one more question before we start, but it's book related. So in terms of book sales, because I've heard you talk on other podcasts about like becoming an apologist and selling books is probably not a good idea. You're not going to make a ton of sales in books. Right. But I wanted to ask you, like, how has this one done in comparison to like Cold Case Christianity or any of your other books that are somewhat popular? Has the start of the sales been like on par? Has it been higher?
It's higher for sure, but that's because you're now 8 books in and you've developed an audience. So they go, oh, that's the guy from Cold. And when I came out, I was just nobody at all, out of the gate, never written a book. And I had to start from zero and slowly build something by word of mouth. And so it's really hard. Now, I will tell you that, I always say this, people will say, well, how can I do what you do for a living? Well, I don't do what I do for a living. I have a pension. My living has still been my pension. None of this stuff has ever approximated my pension. And the cop pension is probably not going to be all that high. So it's a very small, niche-y kind of world. And for me, this is my creative outlet, right? Like we tinker on YouTube, but not a lot, because for me, I love to write, and I wanted to be a writer when I was in college, but I just ended up in the arts instead. But when I first started, I was a journalism major. I wanted to write novels. But then that just took a weird turns, and then here I am now in my 60s writing. That's what I want to do next. I actually would love to be able to turn the corner and do fiction. I'll tell you what I think the difference is, and I say this all the time to people, that I think nonfiction is like a cover band, and fiction is like a singer-songwriter. And there's lots of good cover bands that have the technical ability to play the notes, but if you ask them to write the hit, it's a little harder, right? That's what singer-songwriters do, is they actually write the hit that later on somebody else will cover. And so I knew that the next level up to do fiction would be really a huge jump, and I may never be able to make that jump. But what we're trying to do here by telling these stories, these murder stories along the way, and these are all grounded, like when you do fiction, you're going to jump off. I'm not limited by what really happened. I can actually now just create stuff. But I thought at first, can I articulate powerfully something that is grounded in a case before I jump off and start to write fiction? And that's what we're trying to do in some of these books as we transition.
Speaking of like you using real life cases to kind of make some of your points in your book, that there's really no one else in this space who can do anything near what you're doing. And I wanted to say this and get your thoughts on it's going to make you feel a little bit uncomfortable. Okay. But here it is. You are my favorite apologist. Okay.
Well, you're very kind. You're right. I am uncomfortable with that.
Exactly.
Just because I feel like I haven't earned that. There's people, we stand on the shoulders of giants.
Right.
Who are the real apologists, who are the ones who really are digging up this stuff. In other words, those folks are writing our case notes, our end notes, our footnotes. Those are the folks who are there. And we're just standing on those shoulders, like a guy like Richard Bauckham. When I wrote Cold Case Christianity, I'm thinking, do I really need to write this book? This dude's done a better job. But it's not nearly as accessible, I think, because people aren't seeing it in the context of crime scenes. And we're all familiar with that. So I'm just trying to translate. And I realized this back at the ETS in Baltimore. It was probably about 8 years ago. And it was I was in Baltimore for my first time at an ETS, an Evangelical Theological Society week. And I remember going to these talks and thinking, I'm not even willing to ramp up to get to that level in terms of, that's just not who I am. I'm not the expert you call into trial. I'm the person who helps you write the closing argument, right? I'm the persuader, I hope, at the end of all that evidence. And I'm going to have to stand on the shoulders of those experts. But I realized that at ETS, is we need translators as much as we need experts. And so I think, at least that's how I see myself. I'm just a translator. I'm just a guy who's going to take at the end of the case, I'm going to try to throw this in a way you can catch it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let me explain some of the reasoning behind why I say that. So probably the biggest reason, well, I guess there's two big reasons. So the first reason is that the way that you come and approach this is just unique. And I already said that. It's like no one else is reaching back into no one else is a cold case detective, let alone someone who's been on NBC and been on Dateline and all this. Like, there's no one else that's been in your position to bring what you can bring to the table. And it's just super fascinating to to hear the stories and see how you're applying that to Christianity, and your testimony and all of that is just super, super cool. So that's like about you and your personality. Well, I guess the second one is as well. But from like a philosophical, academic standpoint, you say that you're not an expert, and I don't consider myself an expert either. But I think that you at least have a strong appreciation for like good thinking, good critical thinking, and philosophy. And I think it kind of comes natural to you. So like when I've read your books, I can tell that you have a really strong appreciation for philosophy. And that to me is something that I do too. I mean, I want to make sure that I'm not saying things that are just super silly and completely off base in terms of like what actual philosophers would say or believe.
Yeah.
So, and I see that in your work, and I appreciate that so much. And so there's more reasons why I say that, but I'll leave it at that. I don't want you to have to come back on that, because I've already made you uncomfortable enough. Let's get into.
Well, what's great about this though, and I've watched you from the beginning, right? So I always knew there's going to be a generation of young men and women who are going to blow the socks off of anything we could have imagined in terms of reach for what we call Christian apologetics, and it's probably going to happen in digital formats, and that's what you've done. And so I always look at that and I think, okay, so we. Each of us has got a niche that we are working in that leverages our abilities, leverages our unique story. And I knew I stay in my lane. I talk about this all the time. I do a thing called Cross-Examine Instructors Academy with Frank Turek, where we're bringing in people who want to be apologists. And the one thing I'll say at the very beginning of the first day is that we have to learn what is our lane, what's our X, and how do we stay in our lane. And I try to stay in my lane, right? I know who I am. I know who I'm not. And I think I'm more comfortable with that now at 60 than I was at 40 or maybe at 30, where I feel like, okay, I can kind of see now where this is headed, because I'm on the back nine, right? It's easier to see what your score is going to be in that tournament once you're in the back nine. So I can kind of see where this is going. And I recognize that I know how to stay in my lane. And that's what I think for all of us who are right now listening to this video or watching this video. If you're watching this, you're probably a content consumer like we all are. You can't be a good writer if you're not a good reader. You can't really make good video if you aren't somebody who watches and appreciates good video. So all of us are content consumers. But at some point, you made a decision. I made a decision to switch from content consumption to content creation. And we have to help others to do this. And it might be crummy at first. I had a blog that was called Please Convince Me when I was a youth pastor. That was just my first step into trying to communicate this beyond my own youth group to the world around me. It was back, we're talking now nearly 20 years ago. Well, the stuff I wrote was horrific. I mean, it was really bad. As a matter of fact, when we launched the Cold Case Christianity website, now almost 10 years ago, I couldn't repost it. All this stuff, I couldn't just carry it over and change the name because it was that bad. I needed to rethink and rewrite a bunch of stuff. And that's where I hope that each of us just takes that first step. Like, start a YouTube channel. Yeah, the first couple of videos aren't going to be great. You can delete them later. But get started. It's all about, you got to start somewhere. And one thing you learn, and I learned this from reading, years ago, Michael Hyatt, is that with blogs and videos, you just got to hit post. You can't be a perfectionist about some of this stuff. Good is good enough in the beginning. And as people kind of weigh in and give you feedback, you can always make changes. You can pull stuff down. You can rewrite stuff. You can say, I'm sorry. You can do all of that. But you have to get started. And everyone who's watching this right now could have a YouTube channel. Yeah, it's going to have 4 viewers at first. We all did. Start the channel. Let's see what happens. Get in the game. Don't be a consumer. Be a creator. Yeah,
there's 2 things I want to say on that, and then we'll turn to the book again. So the first thing is that you don't necessarily have to do YouTube if you want to be an apologist and you want to make an impact. So I actually got the question. I was doing a Q&A just a couple days ago, and people were asking, how can I do what you do? And one of the things I said to them was, well, first of all, it's really difficult on YouTube right now because YouTube recently changed the algorithm, so it's just making it a little bit more difficult for people to get started. But that's not the only way that you can have an impact and do something positive with respect to apologetics. So you can start an apologetics class at your church.
Yeah.
And that's a way that you can have a real big impact, even though you're not going to get thousands and thousands of people listening. You're still going to have a really good impact in some people's lives. And so you may, influence the person who does go on to be on YouTube, and then they're going to, that's the part that you play. And it's not about us, right? It's about the kingdom. We want to just play our part and let God do the rest of it. Right. So there's that. I had something else I wanted to say, but it slipped my mind. Let me get into the details of the book.
Yeah.
So this book is all about Jesus and how he's basically relevant still today. And I asked you before we were scheduling this interview, and I was like, what have you, because you've been on all of the different shows already. Like you've been on with Greg Kokel, you've been on with Frank Turek, you've been on with all these guys, and you've already basically talked about like the overview of the book. And I don't want to do that again because you've already done it. And you've already talked about like why you wanted to do this in the first place. So I asked you, I was like, what can we talk about from the book that you think is like the most important thing that maybe you haven't been asked about? And that was education, which was, shocking to me as it is to, I bet everyone else out here, because it's not sexy. Education is not like the thing that people want to come to watch a video about. It's like Jesus influenced
if you
education.
think about it, I have, like, when you write a book that is going to be a Christian book, it's going to ultimately become Christian curriculum for small groups. You're always thinking about 8 to 10 studies, 8 to 10 sessions. So your chapters need to be in that 8 to 10 range. And so I knew that. And also, man, this is such a big book anyway. I didn't want it to be bigger than that. So I'm trying to figure like which of these 8 to 10 topics should I talk about? But that ends up being a series of talks you could give publicly. And I have done a bunch of these, but I don't think I've ever done the talk on education. I think just because, like you said, it may not be sexy, although it's really amazing what can be recovered. Now, remember, this book looks at the impact that Jesus had on history, but not just that, is it impact from which we can reconstruct the story of Jesus. It's that second aspect that I'm looking for, because you could say, well, Jesus has an impact on hospitals and on care for people who are sick. That's true. On the poor, care for the poor. But where would you go then to reconstruct the story of Jesus? That's the difficult part from that. Especially you can't go back to the buildings and facilities because hospitals are updated all the time. And if you had a hospital in the 12th century, that's been torn down for a new building. So I really can't go back to that building, which is not true for education. It turns out universities, they love old buildings and they want those old buildings to stay because it kind of speaks to their stature, their longevity. Let's not
get ahead of ourselves. I want to talk to you about universities a little bit later because in chapters 8 and 9, okay. I think 8 is the one where you talked about the universities, and we'll get into that in just a second. But I wanted to start with, so back to like the early church. What sort of tangible ways did the early Jesus followers cultivate the life of the mind? Like, what did that actually? So there's one question about like, does the Bible actually teach that you should use your mind? But then, in what ways? The question that I want to ask is, in what ways did they use their mind?
Yeah. So this is what's so great about the Christian worldview. Now, look, it could be said of Judaism, of Islam, and of Christianity that these are often called people of the book, whose chief source of information is the book from which they believe God has spoken in special revelation. So that does help, right? When you have a worldview that starts with information in a book. Now, what's interesting, though, is that Jesus does a couple of things which are unusual. He says that we should worship God with all of our heart, our soul, our minds. That word mind is slightly different when Moses makes the same proclamation. Jesus really uses the same placeholder that Moses uses for intensity or muchness in the Hebrew, right? Whereas Jesus uses this for intellect, for discerning rationally. So this is an idea that in order to worship God, you must worship him with the muchness that comes by adding a worship from the mind. And what's interesting is that Jesus then does the Great Commission. And he doesn't say, hey, I want you to go out and make converts. No, he says, I want you to go out and make disciples. Oh, that's totally different. Because now it's not just a matter of proclaiming a message and you say, yep, I'm in. It's about discipling somebody toward a goal, teaching them something. When Jesus said, go and make disciples, he inaugurated a teaching worldview. And this is why one of the earliest documents you have in the history of the church, after the Gospels, is a document called the Didache, the teaching of the 12 apostles. And it's a document that was used to catechize early believers. So one of the very first documents of Christendom is the training manual for Christians. In other words, we launch quickly as a teaching worldview, and that's exercised immediately. And there were some catechisms that would take, months or years before they would baptize people because they wanted them to know enough about what it is they were being baptized into. So this idea of creating a discipleship model, by the way, if you're going to do this, and now I need a book in order to disciple, well, what if that book's not in your language? Well, now I got to teach you. What if you can't read? What if you don't even have any letters or alphabet in your culture?
Yeah.
Well, we're going to have to create alphabets now and teach you how to read. And so now we've got an entire, it's not long before you see in both monasteries and cathedral schools that this is being expressed fully as a teaching worldview. And it's not long after that starts that you have people, I think Irenaeus is one of the first who will say, hey, we should probably teach more than just scripture. We should be teaching vocations. We should be teaching, I think Tertullian says this as well. You want to be able to teach other aspects of how to become good stewards of what God has given you in addition to just theology. So it's not long before you have a robust teaching curriculum that is part of what it is to become a Christian in the first place.
So people of the book, but let's connect that to like modern day. So how did that actually connect to the universities of today? And you've got a lot of really interesting facts about the current universities, like the top universities are all Christian or Christian influence or Christian started, founded.
Yeah,
so it's all really interesting. But connect the dots for us from the early church, the people of the book, to how education got to where it is today.
Yeah, so
and Christianity's
it's interesting
influence on that.
Yeah, and it's rather organic. Now, look, this is not to say that every people group at some point puts in place a method by which to raise their young, at which to advance their culture, at which to teach values and truth claims to its own culture. This is all true. So I'm not saying that there were no other institutions of learning in antiquity, because there were. But when we say modern university, you have something in mind. Something very specific in mind. Usually you're thinking about a campus in which students arrive and there's a faculty, and the faculty attends to these resident students. And then at some point there's a course of curriculum, and it takes several years. And at the end of that, we award a diploma for a successful completion. Okay, that's what we think of when we think of modern universities. Now, that definition of the modern university appears in antiquity in Bologna, Paris, and Oxford. Those three institutions are founded by Christ followers. And those actually give birth to daughter universities, about 20, 22, 24, right in that range, that then become the universities from which scientists emerged in the scientific revolution. If you trace all of the most important scientists in the scientific revolution, you'll find that most of them trace back to a daughter church of Bologna, Paris, and Oxford. So what's interesting about that is that it's happening organically. It begins in monasteries. As a matter of fact, monasteries became the highest repository of libraries. The monasteries started to collect the important works, not just of Christianity, but of the cultures in which they were situated. So it turns out that when Rome finally falls, much of what we know about Rome and its literature, we can recover not from Roman archives, but from Christian archives in ancient monasteries, because they were basically collecting this data. It's been said that the civilization of Rome is available to us today largely because of the libraries in Christian monasteries. As a matter of fact, the libraries were kind of seen like an armory for the monastery, that like a castle might have an armory. The monastery has a library, and that's the high value there was in reading and learning in monasteries. Now, at some point, each cathedral became a source of education. So as cathedrals emerged, now cathedral schools emerged as well. And it's this history from monasteries to cathedral schools. And I try to show this in the book, how these things feed into the planting of the first three modern universities. Now, what's also interesting about that, and I don't think I have it. So when we wrote this book, I had two research assistants, and a lot of it was just me geeking out on data. And I knew when I did it and collected all the data, there's no way this is going to make it into the book, because I wanted to put in lists, for example, of all of the universities founded by Christians compared to all the universities founded by Jewish people, compared to all the universities founded by Buddhists or Hindus or by atheists. In other words, if you could see the number of universities founded by Christians in comparison to any other group, I knew it would blow you away.
I have that quote. I have that quote saved. I was going to read it out loud because it was so awesome.
Well, and I can tell you, though, that I have it in the end notes. Here's what we did. We put 50 pages of end notes in the book, but we knew that wasn't going to cover it because there were like over 300 pages of end notes. So the other 279 pages are available in a PDF file. You'll see once you get to chapter 5, and you look in the end notes, it'll say, for more, see this PDF file you got to download. Because there's no way that would be twice. It would be more than the size of the book. Would just be the end notes. So, but I wanted to give you that list. Like, what are if I make this statement, what's that based on? Well, here's the list. And so I wanted to give you all those. But it's true that Christians have founded more institutions of education than any other group, and any other group combined.
Yeah, it's by 10, by a magnitude of 10.
It's ridiculous. Yeah, it's ridiculous. Now, a lot of these, not every one of these Christian institutions is still available, but that's also true of other educational institutions from other groups. They don't always have the staying power to make it into the 21st century. But I did make a list of all those. And so, again, I'm only doing tip of the iceberg stuff, because what academic source can I go to get a list of Buddhist universities? I mean, no one's looking. I mean, there isn't a source for this, so I've got to just be creative here. So a lot of this, and I give you the sources I use in the book, so you can kind of look for yourself. I also think as we move forward, that if you can find an academic source online, like a lot of universities will have publicly available data through the university, like especially when it comes to ancient documents. Well, they'll post the translated version of that ancient document on the university website in some archive. So I do point people to those, because I think those are immediately accessible by anyone who's reading, especially if you have the digital PDF, because it's still hyperlinked. You just think, there you go. Rather than, how many of these books did I want to collect? I have a stack that's huge, and I only keep the stack until I write the next book, because this is the only space I have for books. Once it's full, I got to move something out. But I usually keep, I have God's crime scene books here for years. But then at some point you have to push them aside. And do
you mean you have like extra copies of the book, or books that?
No, I mean, I had read 134 books to write God's crime scene. It was the most intensive period of time. It was ridiculous. And so I kept all the 134 reference books on my shelves. But at some point, okay, now you go out and you collect another 50 books to write the next book. Well, where am I going to put them? Like right now, you can't see it, but I've got a stack. I'm stacking here. There's 11 books sitting here that are ready for the next book. And so you just have to try to make room for these things.
Wow, you're already on the next one.
Yeah, we're talking about the next one now. But so the idea of education coming up, right? This view of the world that starts off by saying, hey, no, we are thinking. You can argue. Now, here's what I think gets interesting. How many times do you see people in this generation argue that we're not a thinking group? I think you see it a lot. Yeah, and that's a shame, because we're coming out of a tradition that ought to compel us to be the foremost thinking group. Yet I think we've just embraced a cultural view of Christianity that is kind of like, hey,
just have faith.
Yeah, and I'm a Wallace, so if you're a Wallace and you're raised in a Wallace family, you're a Christian. That's really no. This is a completely different approach. But I think for a lot of us, we just claim these things because this is how we were raised, and this is kind of who we are, right? Just like a part of our innate identity, but we've not thought about it. For example, I know I'm a Wallace, but I haven't done a lot of research to even tell you what the Wallace family, where we came from. I haven't even done ancestry to really trace it back very far. Once I get past my great-grandparents, no idea who my great-great-grandparents were. I don't know their names. I don't know anything about them. Most of us, if you think about it, don't. Yet we live successfully with the last name we have, because it doesn't require us to do it anymore. Well, is that how we're treating our Christianity? Like, I live in California. I identify myself as a Californian, but I have really very little historical knowledge of California. I have some, but not what I should. You could press me on certain things I couldn't answer, but I can tell you, I got it on my driver's license. I'm a Californian.
Yeah, the same was true for me. Same exact thing was true for me. Before my brother became an atheist. That's part of my story. That's why I do what I do now. And before that point, I had not really thought at all about the truth of Christianity. It was just like a thing I did on the weekends, or it was I was so deeply into it that it was like just a thing that I did all the time. So it was on the weekends, but it was also midweek and multiple times midweek. So, and I just did that, but I never thought deeply about it. And it's weird that I never did. Yeah. And I think that's very common. I mean, I always say me as the same sports announcer. I'm a sports geek. This is football season right now. So when football season's on, I re-up my cable. I only have it for football season. I record every game. So, like, for example, today when we record, I'm behind by like 4 games.
but I just don't watch the news until I finish all 4 games. And I have them on behind me while I'm working. I've got a big TV above my head here that I just turn it on while I'm working so I can kind of follow along. Well, I can tell you a lot about sports teams that is absolutely stupid in terms of why do I need to know any of that stuff? But the question is, will I spend that much time, though, on this thing that I say is of premier importance? Sometimes, right? So all of us need to be this geeked out. But the early Christians clearly were. And there was a sense that they wanted to pass that information on. This is why you were saying earlier, which is true. If you just did a search right now because you want your kids to go to college, well, if you looked at the top 10 universities on any list, you're going to get some overlap. Not all would be the same 10. So that you end up with about 15, 16 universities, even though you're looking at top 10s. Well, it turns out all of them were founded by Christians, even though most of them do not acknowledge Christianity today. But they were founded originally by Christians. As a matter of fact, 75 of the top 100 universities were founded by Christians. And what's interesting about that, we're looking not just for deep impact, we're looking for, can we reconstruct the story of Jesus from the impact? And that's why I picked universities, because I knew that if I was just to visit the campuses, and we did this digitally, so I know the cases even better than I've written about, right? You just go on these tours. But it turns out that these original buildings used to instruct students often were chapels that still exist on the campus. And if you visit those buildings, guess whose images? Verses from Scripture, stained glass windows. You can reconstruct the story of all of the episodes of the Gospels just from the top 10 universities in the world, because they were started by Christ followers who depicted Christ in a number of different ways. Their charters will even mention elements of Christianity, because their purpose initially often was an entirely Christian purpose. So you're going to be stuck with, unless you wanted to destroy the charters and buildings on the top 10 campuses in the world. The whole idea of this book was, hey, if we destroyed the New Testament, could we reconstruct anything about Jesus from just the fuse and fallout of history? That's how we do no body murders. We don't have a body and we have no idea what happened. And we didn't investigate the case for years, decades. And then when we finally get back to it, okay, I got no crime scene, but I have the fuse. I can tell you what happened before she vanished, and I can tell you what this dude did after she vanished. The fuse and fallout will give him away. Well, the fuse and fallout of Christianity will give away the fact that Jesus is the reason why we call the first century the first century. And I've had people push back on this too a little bit, Cameron, to say, hey, I don't think that this is a strong way to make the case. Well, there's lots of ways to make a case.
Yeah,
everything counts as evidence.
I wanted to get to that too. Like that was going to be the end cap of this interview. You've been like hitting everything that I wanted to ask you about already, which is it's a little frustrating, Jim, that you've already answered all the questions that I had planned to ask.
Okay, so let's just see how that works, Cameron. Okay, you know that if you talk about this, I don't even want to talk about Person of Interest. I'm ready to move on to the next book, right? but the reality of it is that you love this. I'm so geeked out like you about Jesus.
Yeah. That
I don't have an audience in mind. I don't have I just want to show you what I discovered, right? It's kind of like if you found my kids, my son and my daughter-in-law told me, hey, we were starting to watch Ted Lasso on Apple TV. Mm-hmm. It's pretty profane. It got a lot of bad language in it. Okay, I'm not going to, but it's got some overarching themes that I think are redeeming. So we started watching Ted Lasso. Well, why do we tell people about TV shows that we like? Because we really like them. And we want you to hear about it too.
And maybe you'll like them too.
And so this is why we're talking about Jesus all the time.
Okay, let's turn to the subtitle of this. It's in chapter 8. It says, School as You Know It. Do you remember that section?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, because as I was reading that was like the part that stuck out the most to me. It was like every one of these paragraphs is like a mic drop moment. It's like drop a mic, drop a mic, drop a mic, drop a mic. So if you remember it like distinctly, then just run through it real quickly. You don't have to do all of it. But
yeah, so it turns out that everything that we think about in terms of not just a university level education, but a lot of what we call primary or secondary education, it turns out that's the thing. The idea of graded education, well, where did that come from? A Christ follower The idea of education for the young and disadvantaged. It used to be that you would wait a certain amount of time before, and only certain groups could actually get educated. This is actually a Christian invention that comes out of the Reformation. The idea of just even doing handicapped or disabled education for certain specific groups, like the deaf or the blind, Braille, a Christ follower. These are guys who initiated movements, and this is all. So if you just think about the kind of education you probably experienced in America, in which you went to how about kindergarten? Well, kindergarten was the invention of a Christ follower. And then you went through these graded succession of primary school grades in which you graduated from the first grade to the second grade to the third. Well, you can thank a Christian for that too. And then you actually, had a chance to, so everything that you've experienced all the way to your modern university experience, it turns out, or come out of the Christian history of education. Now, this is why we talk about, the impact that Jesus has on Western civilization. Now, I get it that people will sometimes say, Jim, that's all you're doing. You're just tracing Western civilization. There's lots of other civilizations out there. Oh, trust me. Of all of these cultures, which do you think is having the biggest global impact? It's Western civilization. That it gets exported everywhere else until finally a school that is, in Asia looks a lot like the modern universities elsewhere because we've exported ideas. There is no doubt that science launches in European Christendom in the 16th and 17th century. So the argument is, you're just tracing, everyone in Europe was a Christian. That isn't the point. The point is that science and education could have blossomed elsewhere. There were more people in other locations in the world than there were in Europe. Why is it that it's blossoming in Europe, in Christendom? I don't think it's the geography of Europe. I think it's the worldview of Christendom.
Yeah.
And wherever it would have been, it would have had this impact.
Here's the quote that you gave, and it gives some of the figures here. So the quote, I forget the page it's actually from, but I think it's chapter 9. Even though Hindus had a 2,300 to 1,500 year advantage, Jews had a 2,000 to 1,800 year lead, and Buddhists and Zoroastrians had a 600 year head start. Christians established more universities than all other groups combined by a magnitude of 10 to 1. But that gives you an idea of these other religions were around a whole lot longer, so they could, in principle, science and modern thinking and university, all of that could have come about, but it didn't.
Yes. Well, how about this? In the science chapter, I actually chart the progress of science. And interestingly, it starts to take off after Jesus. Remember that Buddhism is in place first. Hinduism is in place first. They're worshiping Indra a lot, like Zoroaster a lot earlier. There are lots of other worldviews inaugurated well before Jesus. Why don't those worldviews inaugurate and catalyze a scientific evolution, educational revolution? Why don't they? Why is it that it's behind Jesus? Now, that could just be a coincidence. And I'm willing to entertain that idea. Or it could be that the worldview initiated by Jesus acts as a catalyst. And I'm trying to figure out the difference. Is it a coincidence or is it a catalyst? Now, I think there are some interesting coincidentals because, you have the monastery schools. You'll see a bump in scientific activity. You'll see a bump at the invention of universities. You'll see a bump at the printing press. You'll see a bump at the Reformation. These could be coincidental. But one thing is clear. When you compare the kind of impact, even the Nobel, now you could argue, the Nobel Prize is a Western prize. Okay, then look at every other scientific prize that's ever been offered for anybody. Now, we have a choice. We have led historically in education and science, but it doesn't mean we're going to continue. And I'm concerned about this, especially once we begin to say that everything is political. And if science is political and religion is political and your view on vaccinations and your view on whatever is all political, and you don't trust the other side because it's not so much that I'm not trusting of the science, I just don't trust the way that side is manipulating the science. Well, now we're going to step out of certain endeavors for political reasons rather than for the merit of the endeavor itself. And that's my concern, right? Now, maybe it's because I was 35 before I became a Christian, and I had an extremely high regard for science. I still do. So I'm not inclined to abandon ship. But the Muslims did. There's a golden age of Islam. It's called the golden age. Why? Because it had a set start and a set ending when they were impactful in the sciences. From about the 8th century, 6th century, or 7th century till about maybe the 12th or 13th century. And you'll see huge scientific activity from Muslims in that period. And then it pretty much drops off the map. that was for theological reasons. And I just want to be careful that we don't make the same kind of mistake. And we only could make it if we don't even understand our own history. And that's why, you write a book like this. And I never thought I would write the book. I did all this work, years ago at what I would call a blogger level. Yeah. In other words, I had done some investigation, but I wasn't the kind of person back then that was like keeping all my sources. I had to get through away half those books. So I had to go back and rebuy them all. And I'm like, okay, I should have done that work. But who's thinking you're going to write a book 20 years ago? So I just didn't, keep it all. But when Zonderbrink came and said, hey, we'd like you to do a book like Cold Case for us. I'm like, well, I did just half of this I could talk about, but it's going to be a lot. I need a couple of years to ramp it back up. And they gave me 2 years to research it. So that's why it ended up happening. So
let's turn to Galileo now, because this is I think one of the main stories that gets told in culture.
Yep.
That the reason why the church is so against science and so against critical thinking is because of Galileo and the Pope during that time. He just put him in jail and he died in jail and stuff. And it's that's the reason why. So let's talk about that and some of the circumstances that actually surround Galileo and why that sheds light on why the story is not what it really amounts to.
Yeah, most of my conversations about this are indebted to Richard Howe at Southern Evangelical Seminary, because Richard and I are good friends, and he geeks out on these things. If you've ever been on Richard Howe, he's a crack up, right? Because he will sit and talk about things at depth for hours.
He's awesome.
And he's awesome. And he's very giving of his time, so he's just awesome all the way around. But what was interesting about I kind of had the same, that thumbnail you just gave of Galileo was perfect, because I think that's the thumbnail all of us have in our head, right? Yeah. He's going to come out and he's going to argue that the solar system is heliocentric rather than geocentric, that it doesn't revolve around the Earth, the sun doesn't revolve, that the Earth's revolving around the sun. And sure enough, Pope Urban VIII ends up spanking this guy and throwing him in jail for the rest of his life, because all these Christians are anti-science and they wanted to stifle this view of the cosmos. Okay, first of all, he was under house arrest, very nice house arrest. His conditions for arrest were, we can call it an arrest, but really it's not as we think about it. Urban VIII and Galileo at one time were very cordial toward each other. There were others prior to Galileo, like Tycho Brahe and Copernicus, who had argued for a heliocentric solar system and had no problem with the Pope. Galileo does that. Now, the Pope is actually willing for Galileo to publish his findings as long as he published them as a theory, like all the other scientific theories. Remember, Pope Urban VIII is not anti-science. He's actually agreeing with the science of the time, which from Aristotle to Ptolemy had been about a geocentric solar system. So he's just agreeing with that science. Now here comes a new understanding of the solar system. And this is not so much that Galileo is butting heads with religious people. It's that Galileo starts by butting heads with other scientific thinkers, natural philosophers who disagreed with him. And so Pope Urban VIII was willing for him to post this, to write about it, as long as he left it as a thing. Now, here's what Galileo does. And I always say it this way.
This is the most important part of it. Yeah,
Galileo, for the most part, was spanked by people who he was around because he was spankable. This dude was a jerk. And he would write things that were, I hate to say he's a jerk, but you get the idea. He was a little bit feisty. And the way he approached it, he wrote a fictional account of the interaction between a thinker like Galileo and the Pope, and he called the Pope in his fictional account Simplico, meaning simpleton. Well, eventually, you stick your thumb in the eye of the Pope enough times, he's going to stick his thumb in your eye, and that's what happens here. But in the end, I can tell you this, Galileo never abandoned his view of Jesus because he didn't think it was compatible with his science. No, he died a Christ follower. He actually died a Roman Catholic. He did not abandon his Roman Catholicism nor his belief in Jesus because he saw no distinction, no rub that was preventative between embracing both truths. So I think in the end, we've kind of taken that story, but here's what it comes down to. In the end, if Christianity is anti-science, it should not have had the catalytic effect it did on the sciences. So if you said, okay, no, I don't agree with you, Jim. I still think that Galileo was treated poorly by Roman Catholics, by the Roman Catholic papacy. Okay, then all you can really say is that the Roman Catholic papacy had a problem. But that's not doesn't mean that all Christianity, all Christ followers have a problem. If that was the case, why are so many Christ followers fathers of disciplines in the science? And that's what you have, is you have a history replete. No group has had more of an impact in fathering modern science disciplines than Christians. They are responsible for more of the foundations of like modern chemistry, modern biology, modern astronomy, all the way down to quantum mechanics and computer sciences. No one has established more scientific disciplines as a group than Christ followers. That's because we don't have in it. We're not anti-science. We've actually been the catalyst for the sciences. Look at the scientific revolution. That's not a Christian term. That's not our term. That's their term. Yet it's dominated by what? Oh, Christians. Oh, Jim, but some of those Christians weren't really committed Christians. They maybe were only Christian in name only. Well, look, this is true for everyone who makes any claim about owning any worldview. Most people don't examine their worldviews all that deeply. So this could be said about anybody. The point is, what is it about the Christian worldview? And I give like 7 reasons why it catalyzes the sciences that actually kickstarts it. And it is unique to the Christian worldview.
I've got another quote here, and you didn't mention this, so that's why I'm bringing it up. You say, by comparison, years earlier, Tycho Brahe, is that how you say that? Mm-hmm. And Copernicus.
I think it's Tycho Brahe. Yeah.
Brahe.
Go ahead.
Yeah, well, you basically mentioned these 2 guys who proposed the heliocentric model before Galileo, and you say, but neither suffered the same fate as the obstinate and evocative Galileo. And you say, any apparent conflict between Roman Catholic leadership and Galileo, therefore, does little to prove that Christianity was or is hostile to science. And here's the last quote. It proves only that these 2 men, Galileo and that Pope, had a complex relationship and that the timing of history did not happen to favor Galileo's proposal.
That's right. That's exactly right. And so a lot of it, though, is how you sell an idea. I mean, you know that the entire historical view of the solar system had been in one direction. And you're going to come in and make a claim that's contrary. So then the question becomes, well, how do I make this claim in a way that's persuasive rather than obstinate? And a lot of us, are so prideful that we're like, no, we're right. You're wrong.
Yeah.
And so we come in and that's our view. And I wish I could go back and replay those conversations, be present for the conversations to see where this thing went south, But the reality of it is that the papacy had a vested interest in the lunar calendar, right, for Easter. It had a vested interest in astronomy. It wanted to get it right. It had a vested interest in natural sciences. The natural philosophies were taught to the Middle Ages, or not the dark. I don't say the Dark Ages, but during the Middle Ages, more people learned about science from universities established by Christ followers, and the papacy supported all that. I mean, they funded all that. So it turns out that to argue that we're anti-science, but most people in Europe, and even the region that used to be called the Roman Empire, that those people, for the most part, knew what they knew about the natural sciences based on their educational experience, which was funded by the papacy. So I just don't think it's fair to say that. And clearly, the outcome shows us that Christians have not been anti-science because we have been leaders in the sciences.
So I want to get to 2 objections now, okay? And I want to see how you handle them. One of them you already mentioned earlier, okay? It was like the coincidence objection. So science arose in a Christian context, but it was bound to arise eventually. What is your response to that?
Yeah, I think it was bound to arise eventually. I think there was a box of human creativity, of human ingenuity, of human rationality, that someone had to open that lid. But here's the thing: it's the Christian worldview that opened the lid. Now, you could argue that maybe we could have gotten to those aspects that if there's a God, that he is distinct from his creation. If there's a God, there's one orderly, rational God. If there is, and by the way, this helps us to ground even our own rational thinking. If there is no God, why would we think that where we land right now through an evolutionary process has brought us to a place rationally where we could actually make true declarations or true observations or true inferences? We'd have to argue, well, no, this is as good as we can do as the point of it. But if we're created in the image of a rational God, well, then we can have some confidence that we have the rational ability to discern our environment. There are lots of aspects of the Christian worldview that open up the box from which, and this is why it's always a cumulative case. So I would never argue, well, this is just one thing. No. Well, hasn't history demonstrated that is it a coincidence then that Christians are the most active in this space? Is it a coincidence? I mean, one coincidence, you can run off to coincidence. But when you start to see the bumps in activity related to another coincidence and another coincidence, but if this was a case, you would say, dude, why isn't this guy in jail? You're going to call all these things coincidences? When we get in front of a jury, we're going to say they want you to believe that all of these things are coincidences and that he is not responsible for this murder. You see what I'm saying? The cumulative cases actually have some power in that they can inoculate you from a one errant inference. If I only have one thing, I could be wrong about how I'm inferring that one thing. But if I got 20 things that point to the same inference, what are the odds I'm wrong in the same way 20 times? This is why cumulative cases help us to make proper inferences. And I think this is just one of those cumulative cases, both within the sciences, within education, and then when you add art, literature, education, world religions, and science, this is a large cumulative case. And that's why I think, this is why I've never been a guy. I've always, all my cases in front of a jury have been cumulative. And I always make an effort to show that visually so they can go, yeah, what are the odds that's a coincidence? That doesn't seem reasonable. So I've had cases, by the way, where there's no body, no confession, and we convict this guy, and everyone's like, nah. And then sure enough, he eventually confesses, either before a parole board or at sentencing. At some point, he does confess, and he gives us the location of the body. And now we know, okay, those weren't coincidences. Those were actually, pieces of evidence that you used cumulatively.
So here's where I think the conversation can progress. So the person can say, or the skeptic can admit that, like, okay, Christianity had this impact. It impacted education this way and science and all of that. But none of this actually matters. Okay, since even if all that's true, it doesn't mean that Christianity itself is true. So what is your response to that objection?
Well, I always say that I always agree with all those kinds of claims because that's true. Doesn't mean that I never see where we're beyond a possible doubt, because that's a standard I don't try to reach. I'm trying to reach beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, what I did in this book is I said, imagine a scenario where we have no evidence from the crime scene called the New Testament. We're going to ignore the New Testament and just see if we can reconstruct it from the fuse and fallout. Okay. So that's my premise to begin with. All right. Now, what's interesting about it is if you said, okay, I cannot find an example anywhere in the history of humans in which a fictional character has had this kind of impact on the aspects of culture. And I've had skeptics online already say, well, look at Luke Skywalker or Neo from The Matrix. I mean, you have, by the way, a lot of these are Christ figures in fiction drawn from either an unconscious or conscious mimicking of the overarching Jesus story. Neo is a Christ figure,
Savior
in fiction. But my point is, regardless, do you think those folks are going to catalyze the sign? Well, let's wait 1,000 years and see if they've had any impact. Let's wait 1,000 years and see if they call this century, or whatever century Luke Skywalker is first written, if they call that the first century at some point. They're probably not. There's not another parallel of a fictional character that has had this kind of impact on human history. Written about more than anyone else, sung about more than anyone else, drawn, painted, etched, sculpted more than anyone else. A catalyst for education, a catalyst for the sciences, more represented than any other group in the sciences, and mentioned by every other world religion, even though he refuses to return the favor. That's who Jesus of Nazareth is. Now, interestingly, if there's not another fictional character in the history of fictional characters who's ever had that kind of impact, I think it's a reasonable inference that Jesus is not a fictional character. But you're not going to find another mortal human who's had that kind of impact either. You won't. List them all. And that's why I think it's reasonable to infer that he's more than a mortal human as well. So there is an aspect of this. And again, I'm only talking about the stuff that's ignoring the New Testament. Now, I've had people say this all the time. I wish I had, we didn't have video, didn't have a body, didn't have any evidence from the crime scene. They find him guilty. Then we debrief the jury and they're like, yeah, it was a good case. We only took 4 hours to come to a verdict, but man, it would have been a lot easier if you'd have had a witness. It would have been a lot easier if there had been photographs of the crime scene. Well, it turns out we have that stuff with Jesus. We have the eyewitness accounts of the Gospels. This case is much stronger than I'm making it in this book. This is a worst case scenario book. And in this worst case scenario, you have more than enough reason to know that Jesus is who he said he was. And here's how I always put it. If you were on a plane and somebody was sitting next to you and did not have a Bible in their lap, but they had memorized the Romans Road, would they be able to, just from what they have memorized, lead you to Christ? To talk about sin, to talk about your need for a Savior, to walk through those passages they had memorized from the book of Romans and lead you to a saving faith? Could someone do this from a platform at a stadium where you don't have a Bible in your hand And you don't even know what they've got a podium. You can't see what they're reading from, but they've memorized enough scripture to be able to tell you the gospel, to share the gospel with you. Is it possible that Philip could do this with an Ethiopian, even though he does not appear to have a New Testament in his hand? Is it possible that Peter could do this with Cornelius when he doesn't appear to have an Old Testament scroll in his hand, but he's there talking about Jesus? And it says that everyone, Cornelius and his entire family, were saved that day. Now, if that's possible, what if the mechanism by which you are learning about Jesus is not someone who's sharing what they've memorized, but is simply from, let's say, the journals of scientists who wrote robustly, quoted scripture, talked about the gospel, talked about Jesus in their personal journals? Could you be saved if there was no New Testament available to you, but all you had were the nooks and crannies of information from culture, because that's where Jesus left all of his fingerprints? Could you 1,000 years later come to a saving faith in Jesus from the information you could glean from the buildings, from the science fathers, from the literature that's not Christian literature? That's my whole point. If you could be saved and sitting in the airplane, if you could be saved like Peter was talking to Cornelius, this is the power of how much Jesus has impacted the world. His data is recoverable. You're not going to scrub Jesus by simply destroying the New Testament. He's had that kind of impact. By the way, I think you could scrub a lot of fictional characters, at least the data needed. Because here's what's funny, is that when you talk about Neo, you're not going to cite every movie line. But when you talk about Jesus, you often are citing every verse. At some point, it's going to get restored because someone's going to talk about it and write it down.
Well, so what about like Muhammad? Right, because he's had a pretty significant impact over in the Middle East for sure.
Yep.
Right. Yep. So how does that interact with this argument? Because
so he's had an impact, but not the impact that Jesus had. I'm not suggesting that no one else has had an impact, but I'm suggesting that no one else has had this kind of impact. It's far more than any other living human being. Let's just go through those 5 areas. Okay, it's not even, as far as historical characters go, it's Jesus of Nazareth, written about more in the Library of Congress and in Google Books, anywhere you want to search for this, than any other historical figure. The next one down is not Muhammad. You got to go way down that list before you get to Muhammad. It's not just that, it's the arts. Well, you can't even draw an image of Muhammad. But Jesus has been a catalyst for more creative activity. I didn't talk about that, but it turns out the history of science, of art, is such that every master, the top 3 masters in every historic genre of art, from antiquity to pop art or Dadaism or surrealism or whatever you want to say is in the last 100 years, if you look at the top 3 artists, they've all drawn Jesus. All of them. The top 3 in every category. I've got an A to Z listing globally of how many times Jesus has been illustrated, painted, or sculpted in every nation in the world. This can't be said of Muhammad. This can't be said of Muhammad in music. This can't be said of Muhammad in education. And it could be said during a small period of human history in science, but then it stops for reasons the imams wanted. In other words, they were saying, hey, we ought not be involved in this. Our worldview actually prohibits us from being involved in this. So there's the difference, is that one of these worldviews opens up all the potential of humans. Other worldviews don't open up the same way, or they close altogether. So if we look at the potential of humans in art, literature, these are the things the way that humans express themselves and explore the world around them. No worldview has done a better job in opening that Pandora's box than Christianity.
So I want to go ahead and close out the interview, but there's one last question I want to ask you, and it's unrelated to the book. But okay. So the question, and we can actually cut this out if you don't want to answer it on the publicly. But so why don't you do any debates on like YouTube or online at all?
Yeah.
Like why don't you debate anyone? What's the reason
so why don't I do? Yeah, so there's a reason why I don't do debates. It's the type A anal retentive personality, compulsive personality I have. If you tell me you want me to write a book like this, well, then goodbye for a couple of years while I deep dive into this, and it'll become my obsession. I don't do debates for the same reason. I know that I would spend a year. I would demand that of myself, and so that's why I just don't want to stop this is why I'm probably not a YouTuber as much as I need to be. I think the YouTube is the future. I think the video is the future. And you can see my stuff's always very visual. So I believe in a visual presentation. I believe in a visual approach. But the reason why I know if I'm going to do it, I got to do it all the way. I got to be the best I can be in that field. And I feel like right now that's I'm an author. And the only reason why I do any of the other stuff is because it gives me the opportunity to write books. So I don't see writing books as like one of a palette of things I'm doing. It's the whole thing I do. And I just do the other stuff to support the writing of books. Now, I will tell this to you because you're a master at video. And I want to encourage you. I know you could write a book. Now, you might say, well, yeah, but I think it's a both and. I think we need to be both. It's not an either or. It's a both and. This is going to have more reach. Video will have more reach going forward than anything else. But here's what I discovered writing this book, Person of Interest. That when let's say we do a video together and it gets 100,000 views. Okay, people are not going to download that into their hard drive. They're going to watch it. It will not occupy 100,000 geographic locations.
I heard you talking about this with Greg.
Yeah, when you write a book, it does. I want all of us who are doing this work to do both. And you might say, well, yeah, but this is I get it. I have a sweet spot and everything else seems like not as good, because it's not my sweet spot. But I get that. And we're all going to do better in one of these forms of communication than in another. But what I love about it is that some of these are more impactful. I think video is. Well, some of these have more lasting power. And I think that writing does. So
I've got an idea for a book, but
yes. I don't want you to say it out loud because I want to talk about it publicly and I don't want anyone else to get your idea. So you got an idea for a book. Go ahead.
Okay. What did you say? I shouldn't talk about it live or what?
Well, I don't know if we're going to include this video when we go live with this. I don't want you to give away your idea for a book before you actually write it.
No one would be able to duplicate it.
Okay, good. Go
okay.
For it.
So the idea is every time I go and interview like an apologist, I take a portrait of them. And so the book idea would simply be to just put all the portraits in a book and then just write like a little thing about them.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's it. Exactly. I always say, write the thing that only you could write, and no one can ever write that book again, because only you could write it. And that's exactly the kind of thing you should do. And people have done a great service to the church by doing something like Lee Strobel's books, where he's introduced people. I mean, if you think about it, the golden age of apologetics, the way that you and I know it, probably started with Case for Christ, right? Because he introduced all of us to these folks that we weren't paying attention to. And we're like going, oh, wow. Like I bet you William Lane Craig, for example, I mean, he was always on the map. But for a lot of lay people, they were introduced to these folks by way of Lee Strobel. So it's a great service to the church. So I think it's a both and. But I'm never going to be as good. And that's the only reason why I've thought about doing debates. I get asked to do them. And I always feel like, okay, but I would need probably at least 3 months to prep. So, I mean, I just know me. I'm too obsessive about it. So that's why I haven't done them. Okay. And I will sometimes also talk about these issues. If somebody makes a complaint or makes an observation, I just don't mention their name. I'm just at a point right now in my life where I don't want to publicly put my thumb in people's eyes. I just don't think it's helpful.
All right, man. Well, let's we'll close this out. Thank you guys for tuning in. See you guys later. Hey, it's me again. Actually, don't leave yet. I've got something super, super important to tell you. So first of all, you're awesome. Like you just watched a really, really long video just now, and you're still watching it. That is actually pretty amazing. Secondly, we have literally hundreds of other apologetics related videos for you to watch on our channel. Go check them out. I've interviewed exorcists, hosted debates between Christians and atheists. I've even made response videos to atheists. All of that is available on our channel. Go check it out. Third, I rely on people that see value in my work, people like you that watch videos to the very end, to keep the lights on around here. Literally, this is how I feed my family. So if you see value in the work that I do, please consider supporting this ministry and becoming a patron. Links to that are in the description. Oh, and have I mentioned that Christianity is true?